of media about it, in particular because as soon as anything impacts on Auckland, it gets quite a bit more media, doesn't it? And so there's quite a lot of media about it. So this presentation isn't about that incident. This is more the work that our team now do that's prompted by that incident around understanding it, what's happening, what are we doing, because it's obviously something which has created a challenge for our territorial authorities to treat water, and they very much rely on the expertise of people in this room to help understand what's going on. And we have one of our colleagues from Taumata Arawai
Anybody who's in this group, we got the room for you to sit here if you want to sit at the table from Arawai, Macho.
So we have one of our colleagues from Taumata Arawai here to listen in as well, because obviously this is clearly a particularly... I think they're here for interest as opposed to present, because this is a particularly topical issue around being able to meet drinking water standards for those that take water from the Waikato River. So with that, I'm not sure, is it Mike? Jonathan?
And before you start, Mike, welcome to the table, you and your roku. We're going to take the paper as read. I do know you're going to slides, and then when you finish your slides, we'll do questions and after. So, Mike, if you want to introduce your team, ka pai tēnā.
Tēnā koe, Chair, and tēnā koutou councillors. Over Jonathan Caldwell and Dean Sandwell. So both these gentlemen have been working on the issues around arsenic in the river. As you'll see, there's a lot of historic information, but also we're drawing together a whole lot of threads around understanding, as Brent said. So I'll pass over. Do you want to introduce yourself? Right button, right silver button.
Kia ora, Tammy Vella. I am Water Services Officer for Taumata Arawai, the Water Services Authority. Just here out of interest, we've been dealing with Waikato, Waipa and Hamilton with their management of this issue. So interesting to pass on to my colleagues, and thank you.
We'll crack into it. So the issue, so in late November 2024, we saw multiple treatment plants along the Waikato River have high arsenic in the treated water, and for Hamilton City, we saw a 7 to 9 times increase in the concentration of arsenic in our treated drinking water. Arsenic in the Waikato River is not a new thing. So this is a little snip from 1980s paper, New Zealand Journal of Science, outlining geothermal sources and enrichment of arsenic from these geothermal activities and natural geothermal inputs into the Waikato River and transformations and mobility of that arsenic through the river and the hydro lakes. As the Waikato River travels from Taupo northeast down to Port Waikato, in the upper reaches, it passes through several geothermal systems. And as a result, we see total arsenic in the water increasing from Taupo and peaking around Ohakuri and Whakamaru. This is a little snip from a 1980s Waikato Regional Council report, 1990. And it shows total arsenic on the y-axis, and you can see it increasing from Taupo and then peaking around Ohakuri and then progressively decreasing downstream. And the drinking water guidelines at the time is that red line at 0.05 grams per cubic metre. And you can see that the concentrations were below that. And the report hinted at that the concentrations were decreasing with time. There's 2 lines there showing 2 different time periods. And then when we compare it to our current drinking water guidelines of 0.01, you can see the need for treating of arsenic in our drinking water supplies. Trend analyses on the Waikato River for arsenic show Taupo increasing at 1% per year. And then the downstream monitoring sites will see decreasing trends from 0.5 to 1.4 from 1991 to 2020. And Bill Vant, who was the author of this report, attributed this to increased loads from natural and geothermal sources in and around Lake Taupo, or the increasing trend at Lake Taupo, and reductions in the load of arsenic that was just discharged associated with the Waikiri power plant for decreasing trends downstream. More recent data is plotted up here. So on the left figure, we can see arsenic concentrations, which are medians over 5 years from 2018 to 2023. So the colors indicate the median concentration, and also the size of the circle also shows the concentrations. So you can see how the concentrations increase from Taupo, peaking at Aokuri and Whakamaru, and progressively decreasing downstream. Also, on the figure on the right, you can see how the total arsenic varies with within that 5-year period. So these are box plots that's giving you an idea of the distribution of the data. And you can see that there's a wide variation at specific sites with how much arsenic there is in the water. And if you paid attention to the slide previously where you saw arsenic in Taupo was below that 0.01 drinking water guideline, well, now you can see it's now crept above that with those increasing trends. And if you look across the river, you see that generally the arsenic concentrations are above those drinking water guidelines. So reason for us to treat our drinking water. For that variation that we see, there's a bit of interannual variability in arsenic, but there's also a really strong, significant seasonal signal in the arsenic concentrations on the river. So generally we see higher arsenic concentrations in summer months and lower in winter months. For reference, you can see Hamilton Airport, the runway in the lower left. And so this is our site that's just before it comes into Hamilton. So this gets a little bit more complicated, but bear with me. So geothermal sources are what enrich arsenic in our water, and water temperature, flow, and absorption and desorption to different particles influence how arsenic moves through the environment. Then it gets a little bit trickier, and we see arsenic has these different forms or speciation. So depending on the conditions in the water, we can see these different forms of arsenic being present in the water. In conditions where we have lots of oxygen, we'd be expecting to see arsenic 5 being favored. And then in conditions where we'd see less oxygen, we'd see more arsenic 3. So we call that like reducing environment. So down in the sediments, we're more likely to see arsenic 3. And in the lower areas of the lake, we might see more arsenic 3 when the hydrolakes stratify and get cut off from the surface. To make it more complicated, phytoplankton and bacteria can change the forms of arsenic. So they can switch between these inorganic arsenic forms 3 and 5. But then there's another type of arsenic, these organic forms of arsenic that they can also produce. So that makes the story a little bit harder. And then in the Waikato River, there's a study, I think from 1985, that showed cyanobacteria transforming arsenic 5 to arsenic 3. Also, we've got macroalgae, and they're described as hyperaccumulators of arsenic, so they can store a lot of arsenic and have really high concentrations of arsenic. And now we've got the golden clams, and being a bivalve at really high densities, they're going to have influences on exchanges between sediment and water, and what impacts that has on arsenic, well, we don't know yet. So why is arsenic speciation important? So the arsenic 5 is what we would predominantly see in the Waikato River. It's thermodynamically favored. So the treatment plants are pretty good at removing this arsenic 5. So you see, I've got a whole heap of arsenic 5 in the river, goes to the treatment plant, and we see just a little bit of arsenic 5 in the drinking water. And so our total arsenic is reduced substantially from what it was in the river. Then when we mix arsenic 3 into the story, and we have a higher proportion of arsenic 3, we see arsenic 3 not being removed as efficiently because it has quite different behaviours than arsenic 5. And then we see a higher total arsenic in our drinking water. So arsenic speciation isn't new in the Waikato River. And this is a snip from a PhD thesis of arsenic in the Waikato River. And that was published in that paper from 1980s that I showed you earlier. So basically it shows the percentage of arsenic 3 from Taupo down to Tuakau, and you see quite high proportions. This was done over a monthly sampling period across 1 year, and they had 2 months where they found arsenic 3, but predominantly arsenic 3 is not in high proportions. So drinking water standards, I think there's a few key things to highlight here. So there's maximum acceptable values are outlined in the New Zealand drinking water standards. And these are based on the World Health Organization guidelines. And that's that 0.01 grams per meter cubed. In the guidelines, it talks about milligrams per litre, but that's an equivalent unit. So we present everything in 0.01 grams per meter cubed. Something to highlight though is that the World Health Organization guidelines for arsenic are provisional, and there's actually a lot of uncertainty about the actual risks at low concentrations and a growing body of literature showing human health impacts at those low levels, which are the MAV and below. So treatment of arsenic should be maximized, and the US EPA actually has a maximum contaminant level goal of 0, and we also see other countries like the Netherlands who have a voluntary criterion that's 10 times lower than the MAV. And the reason that was developed on a cost-benefit analysis of cost of treating arsenic versus the human health cost of kidney treatment. I'm sorry, cancer treatment. Along the Waikato River, we have several treatment plants highlighted there in black dots. And we have plotted one from Lake Taupo. And in November, the event where we had these exceedances, you see the exceedances in red. So we saw arsenic exceeded at several of these treatment plants. So what did that look like with our routine arsenic monitoring that we complete? So we monitor arsenic at 12 sites along the Waikato River monthly. And what this plot shows is 10-year concentrations of arsenic at all of those sites. So there's a lot going on here, but it gives an idea of the distribution of the last 10 years of total arsenic in the river at each of those sites for each month. And you see some of the seasonality that I've pointed out. And then in black, the November 2024, which was taken early November, so it was before the late November notification of treatment issues. And then we have the December monthly sampling and the January plotted there as well as those black dots. So you can see that the concentrations were a little bit high, but all within the range that we normally see in the last 10 years for each site and season. So what's going on? So in pre-November, we received some treatment efficiency. So looking at the intake versus the outlet concentrations of arsenic from the treatment plants. Treatment plants that are missing from here is because we didn't have the data or it was unclear from the data that they sent. So you can see that generally, if you look at Hamilton treatment plant can remove easily 90% of the arsenic. Then in November, we saw a drop in the treatment plant's efficiency of removing arsenic. So it was a decline in treatment efficiency. So total concentrations of arsenic were within normal ranges, but the ability for the treatment plant to remove arsenic was compromised. Hamilton City Council sent through a whole heap of time series data. And what this graph shows is the total arsenic over time from 2011. And you see the seasonality that I've highlighted before, with higher in summer, lower in winter, and with the MAV there in that red dashed line. When we plot the Hamilton City Council outflow, you also see a little bit of seasonal variation, and you see the ability of the treatment plant to reduce the arsenic. When we plot up the treatment efficiency, we see that seasonal variation as well, and we also can see a couple of instances where treatment efficiency dropped off, notably in December 2015 and again in December in 2021. But generally, you see that the Hamilton treatment plant treats generally over 85% of the arsenic, but we do see these fluctuations. The treatment plant sent through a bunch of water chemistry data, and using that water chemistry data, we looked at if there was any associations with treatment efficiency to water chemistry. It was a little bit limited, but when we look at Hamilton City Council's arsenic removal efficiency, what we found was that if there was more calcium in the water, there was a higher removal efficiency. And when there was lower arsenic, they also had higher removal efficiency. But calcium was the strongest association. But this data set was limited, and there was a range of parameters that we would have liked to have seen in that data set to make this a bit more comprehensive. Then when we get into our data, that from our routine monitoring, what we saw was that in early November, we saw a geothermal spike in arsenic concentrations in Owakuri. And one interesting aspect of that was that we saw quite high chloride. And that's quite interesting because chloride's a conservative tracer, and it's associated with geothermal waters. So that chloride indicates that maybe there was a rapid upflow of geothermal fluid. And if that's the case, then that would be more associated with arsenic 3. And then also chloride is a competitive ion. So when it comes to treatment, it could be a factor in reducing treatment efficiency as we see that chloride move downstream. Chloride wasn't included in the Hamilton City Council data set that we analysed. We also saw, as part of our response, we initiated expanding our suite of routine monitoring measurements, and calcium was one of those parameters. And so after we were notified of the event, we then collected calcium data in December and January. And what was interesting with that is that we saw a decrease, or like a relatively lower concentration of calcium, and we also saw a decrease from our December to our January concentrations, which was interesting. So there was some sort of biological calcium uptake or absorption that was going on there. We also saw signals of reduced conditions in the beds of the hydro lakes, and basically we saw signals where you see these reduced elements increasing concentration. And this plot here shows ammonia, and that we can see quite an increase in ammonia in the November. In the Karapira and Waipapa was missing, with Waipapa. So we don't know what the ammonia was doing in Waipapa on that November, but we see quite high concentrations around Karapira. And concerningly, if we look at the trend data, we also see degrading trends in those reduced forms of nitrogen. So what are our actions and our next steps? So I mentioned that we expanded our monitoring suite. So there's different parameters that are important for arsenic behavior and mobility within the environment. So parameters that can help us understand that better. And then also treatment efficiency and things that might impact treatment plants' ability to treat arsenic and remove it. One of the initiatives that we've taken is to create an online dashboard. This is a work in progress. And the idea with this is that to improve our collaboration and data sharing between drinking water suppliers and ourselves. And there's a little screenshot of the draft schema for the dashboard there on the right. We're also looking into arsenic speciation optioneering. And you might recall when I presented on the Whangamarino, there was a fish kill event in the Maramarua River. And one of the work streams that we're trying to do is develop methodology to measure arsenic and mercury and this is one of the techniques that we could use. They're pretty cool cheap little sensors that you buy that don't have any electronics. So they're called DGTs. And in them, they have this little gel they're pre-made, and you put them in the water, and that gel is specific to something. So for arsenic-free, you can imagine if you put that in the water, the arsenic-free just is continuously binding onto that gel. And so what we get is averaged concentration. So you chuck that out for 2 weeks or a month, and you get this continuous buildup of arsenic-free binding onto that resin, which is really cool because if we have low concentrations or events with spikes, you might not see that when you just take a water sample. So this is a really cool technique, and we're working with Lincoln Agritech and Waikato Uni to get this method sorted for Whangamarino and for the Waikato River. Our understanding of the Waikato River and the impacts of climate change and arsenic will be greatly improved by this massive $10 million boost that Lincoln Agritech are leading. So this MB funded project, and Waikato Regional Council has $70K a year financial contribution and team members that are contributing to this project. And what's really cool is that in October, as part of this $10 million MB project in Lake Karapiro, Profiler Buoy was set up. So that Profiler Buoy is measuring water quality from the surface down to the bottom, measuring carbon dioxide, measuring pH, all these parameters that we're really interested in. And it did show some interesting data through October and November. And what's really cool, but we don't have the results yet, is that some of those DGTs were also deployed and they're sitting in a freezer. So we're pretty keen to see the results of those. So there was some surface and there were depth DGTs that were deployed for arsenic-free in Karapiro. So that's pretty exciting, and that will be really interesting to see what comes out of that. So to summarize, hopefully I've highlighted how complex arsenic is in the Waikato River and the complex interplay between biology, hydrology, and geothermal aspects and geochemistry. And the total arsenic that we saw was within historical ranges. And when I say historical ranges, 10-year, I'm not looking at those historical ranges way back when it was really high. So for each site and season, we saw concentrations that were within what we have seen previously. Speciation data will be really useful to see what happened in the Karapiro, and that will help us form up our plan moving forward as we develop those DGT probes and the methods with that. So we saw reduced treatment efficiency at multiple plants. There was a bit of limited data, and because of that, we hope that the dashboard will help us improve that collaboration, and we can then use some of their data that they collect, their wider water chemistry data, to get us better understanding of what's going on and potential predictors of arsenic issues. And yeah, there was evidence that there was water chemistry changes from different aspects, such as geothermal, biological, and sediment speciation of arsenic. And that $10 million emerging climatic pressures project led by Lincoln Agritech will definitely help us understand that better, and along with our expanded monitoring suite that we've started.
Okay, thank
Any
you,
questions?
Dean. So between Tuwharetoa and Karapiro, that is where the majority of geothermal input into the Waikato River, I would presume, is. And so if you look at the humans who lived in that area for as long as the river's been there, arsenic has been in that water forever and ever. And I do believe, and quote me if I'm wrong, that the dams that are from Tuwharetoa to Karapiro, there's 9 in whole. Behind each of those dams, the biggest holder of arsenic are those dams. So I can presume when the gates are open in those dams, that helps that arsenic travel down the river. Am I right? Because if you look at the past Karapiro, the geothermal input into the river to the port is not as high as Karapiro up the river. And we were all brought up there, and arsenic wasn't one of the things we were worried about. It was the least of our worries. And if it's grown over the years, then I guess it's still not a worry, because from Karapiro to Tuwharetoa, you will still find people in that river, swimming where they shouldn't be, but they're there. So I guess my korero is around what is the human, how bad will arsenic be to us, to humans, as the arsenic form? Is it absorbed by other things that we might, like the fish, the food that we eat in there? Because if so, then there shouldn't be anybody up there living, because we would have died with all the food we eat up there. So I just need to understand, what is the impact? How bad is that impact, considering the people who lived up that river are still there, and they're still doing the same thing they used to do, and the dams are now there. So,
There's a lot of questions there.
No, well, the question is, how
the-
bad is the impact on arsenic to a human who have lived there for many, many years and are going to? And the biggest area of geothermal into the Waikato River is from Karapiro to Tuwharetoa.
Yeah, the hydro lakes definitely accumulate arsenic, and that agate paper talked about 7 to 8% of the arsenic that was coming in being absorbed into sediments. So there's a really large pool of arsenic sitting in those hydro lakes.
Mm.
For the human health side of things, I think maybe, Jonathan, do you want to address that?
I'll be worse than claims.
Yes, so I think a few things about arsenic and uptake in food sources. Typically, arsenic, when it's taken up into fish, it's in the organic form, which is a lot less toxic. However, when it's accumulated into things like watercress, things like that, it's not. It's in that inorganic form, which is going to be more toxic. Another aspect is that the speciation, so the arsenic 3 and the arsenic 5 that Dean was talking about, the arsenic 3 is more toxic than the arsenic 5. So if there's a larger amount of the arsenic 3 in there, that's going to have more of a health impact if it's not being removed at the water treatment plant. And I would say that there's not, as far as I'm aware, any health evidence that I've seen in New Zealand around the impacts of arsenic on, statistically, whether there's a bigger health impact for those that source their food and water from the Waikato River. It's probably because there's a lot of other factors, such as that there's, I suppose, nitrate is another thing that might impact your health. There is a lot of sources that might impact your health through food, mercury, for example, all sorts of things that may compound or confound understanding how much arsenic is impacting our health. Certainly, though, overseas, where you're seeing much higher levels of arsenic in people's drinking water, in perhaps India, where you have it really high in groundwater, the health impacts are very easily observed there, but not in New Zealand.
That's good. Well, watercress won't grow in dirty water anyway. So the majority of watercress that there isn't any as much as any now on the Waikato River. And another one is frogs. You know, there's no frogs anymore because they don't live in dirty water either. But ka pai tēnā. Thank you for your answers.
Jonathan, to finish that question, could you help the committee understand the basis of guidance, whether or not it's acute or chronic long-term exposure?
It's the drinking water standard is chronic, so it's based on a 70 years of life exposure, drinking up to 2 litres. I think
That's seepage, you know, geothermal. No, I won't say that. I was going to say geothermal doesn't actually flow into the river. It's also seepage of the geothermal through the land as well. It's entering into the water system, isn't it?
yes.
Yeah.
So there's geothermal from natural processes. There's likely to be the power stations, the main 2 sources, Wairaki and Ohaki,
Yep.
have over the years reduced really significantly the amount they discharge directly to the river.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
via re-injection, but that re-injection is likely to, I suppose, increase a slow discharge and transfer to the river through groundwater.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to congratulate you, first of all, on the very clear exposition of science. That was a great presentation. And I'd also observe that the use of those old data sets was so important in understanding the baseline. And I also would observe that the guys that used to draw the graphs those days were really good at putting things on the axis so we all could know what you're talking about. So they seem to do that stuff better, I think, in the past than they do nowadays. But I just wanted to, because you guys are all geothermal fluid chemist interests, that's your expertise, and I couldn't help but put up an ad now there is a seminar next week, I'm wondering if you know about it, at the University of Waikato on geothermal fluid chemistry from an expert from Oxford University on Tuesday next week. I think you guys should be there. And that's, I'll give you the details, E201. It's open to the public. It's, you know, an open seminar, E201, 3 to 4 p.m. And I noticed in his announcement for his talk, he's apparently working on temporal and spatial variability of some of the things that you're talking about. So might be useful for you to go and meet the guy and compare notes. Yes. Yeah.
Anybody else? No. There's no more questions. Thank you for your. I can't elaborate more than Bruce because no doubt he would have understood 3/4 of that to my quarter. Okay, but it's good to hear, and you answered the questions I wanted to answer. So ka pai tēnā, kia ora koutou. That's you. Yeah, excellent. So we'll move this in second. I'll move in someone second. The acceptance of this report. Thank you. And our last one, guys, for today is riparian characteristics monitoring in the Waikato River, page 41.
Yes, I'll just hand straight to Mike and Tim. It's just one of the important pieces of work that the science team have been doing over the last little while. We thought it would be useful to bring to the committee so that you can see some of that progress. So over to you, Mike.
Yeah, kia ora again, Chair. And just to mention that I think it was 5 years ago that EPC had the last of these presentations. So Tim and Hayden will talk about actually quite a long-term study into changes in riparian vegetation in the region. So I'll hand over to them.
Okay. See it? It was there. What happened? You do have a slide? Oh, I thought I saw it. Okay, awesome.
Sweet, there we go. Kia ora koutou. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. As Mike mentioned, we're going to provide an update on the Regional Riparian Monitoring Program and specifically results from the most recent survey that we undertook in 2022 and 2023. Just to note that there is a technical report associated with this work. It's currently going through the final stages of the review process, and we anticipate that'll be up on the WRC website by the end of March. So just by way of introduction, I'm sure most of us are aware that riparian margins represent the transitional zone between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. They provide a number of very important ecosystem functions, and some of these include filtering of contaminants from runoff, sediment trapping, stabilization of stream banks, flood attenuation, increased biodiversity, and also regulation of water temperature through stream shading. So riparian management and restoration are recognized as key strategies to mitigate the impact of land use activities on waterways and to achieve freshwater outcomes. And so Council has actively promoted fencing and planting of waterways through a number of projects over time, projects such as Clean Streams, Project Watershed, and a number of other initiatives over the years. Also through implementation of catchment plans like the Waipa Catchment Plan. The Regional Council back in 2002 established the Regional Riparian Monitoring Program, and that was really to understand the state of our riparian margins, but also to track changes in key attributes over time. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overview of our general survey approach, it's a statistically based approach. So since we can't assess every metre of waterway across the region, we select a subset of sites. And as Mike mentioned, we undertake this survey every 5 years. The first one was undertaken in 2002, and then every 5 years since. So we've got 5 separate surveys that have been undertaken over time. So the map to the right there shows sites from the most recent survey, which was undertaken in 2022. So we looked at around 430 sites. Each site comprises a 500-metre segment of waterway. We walk each of those segments and we make observations relating to riparian characteristics. Our samples are split up or stratified by management zone, land use, so that's dairy and dry stock, and also stream order as a representation of stream size. And we do this so that we can represent the wide range of riparian margins across the region. In terms of how we collect this information, I'm sorry, if we can just move to the next slide. Thank you. We collect this information along each of the 500-metre segments of waterway, and I've provided an example there at the top right-hand corner. Each of those points represents a point along the waterway where we've observed a change in a riparian characteristic. So that might be a change from fencing to no fencing, for example, or native vegetation to exotic vegetation. We can then link those points together and calculate a length of waterway associated with each attribute. So for example, for a 500-metre segment of waterway, we might have 400 metres that's fenced and 100 metres that isn't fenced. And we can then aggregate that up to various levels, say for stream orders or to a particular management zone or to the region as a whole. The way we collect the data is by using a Trimble GPS device. It's essentially a smartphone with a GPS receiver, and we use the Survey 123 app along with that. We collect a wide range of attributes relating to riparian characteristics. Some of these are included here, so fencing, stock access, vegetation type and coverage, vegetation width, and stream bank erosion and disturbance. Just move to the next slide, please. So moving on to some of our results, and starting off with region-wide fencing. So the graph there to the right shows the proportion of stream length that is either fenced on both banks, one bank, or on neither bank. So both banks shown there by the green bar, pink bar shows fencing along one bank, and then neither bank is shown there by the blue bars. And we've done this for each of the survey years from 2002 through to 2022. The red dots there represent total fencing. So we're looking at the proportion of total bank length that was surveyed that's effectively fenced. So what you'll notice there straight away is from 2002 through to 2022, we've seen a significant increase in the proportion of bank length effectively fenced. So an increase from about 29% in 2002 up to 58% in 2022. Over the most recent 5 years, it does appear that there has been a decrease in effective fencing. And I just want to explain briefly why this is the case. The main reason for this is that in the West Coast Management Zone, we had a large number of replacement sites in the most recent survey. And this was primarily because of land use change that had occurred. So conversion of pasture through to exotic forestry, which meant we could no longer assess those sites since the surveys focused on pastoral land use only. There were also a number of sites where we couldn't gain access because landowners wouldn't give us permission to access those sites. So the result of that is that there were about 13 sites that we couldn't revisit, where to replace these. And so in the West Coast, we found that our, the estimates of fencing were considerably lower in the most recent survey compared to 2017. So to take this into account, we removed the West Coast sites from our analysis to see how the sort of fencing looks across the rest of the region. If we could just move on to the next slide, please. And we've really seen a flat lining in terms of fencing. So no significant change between 2017 and 2022. If we could move to the next slide, please. So if we then break down our data into major land use types, so we're looking here at dairy versus dry stock. Dry stock here is defined as sheep and beef, deer, as well as dairy support. So on the left-hand side there, we can see the fencing for our dairy land uses. Again, I'm just focusing on that red line there, which is looking at proportion of total bank length that is fenced. So in 2022, we saw that 88% of bank length was effectively fenced for dairy systems, whereas for dry stock, that was considerably lower at 36%. If we look at the past 20 years, from 2002 to 2022, the rate of change was about 2.2% per year for dairy and about 0.9% for dry stock. Of course, if we look at the last 5 years, that rate of increase has slowed considerably. So we've seen about a 1% increase for dairy and dry stock, which is on average about a 0.2% increase per year, noting that that's not statistically significant. So really no change over the past 5 years. So I guess what these results really suggest is that there needs to be a shift in our focus of fencing away from dairy, not away from dairy, but perhaps a greater focus on dry stock systems, which perhaps haven't received the And what we also found from our data analysis is that the rates of fencing along lower order streams, so these are the streams at the top of the catchment, much smaller waterways, are relatively low. So only 48% of first order streams were effectively fenced in the most recent survey. And recent research has shown that a high proportion of nutrients, so nitrogen and phosphorus, are sourced from these low order streams. So really there needs to be a greater focus on fencing off these smaller waterways at the top of the catchments, which certainly provide a high proportion of nutrients. And perhaps they haven't received the focus in the past, if we compare them to your larger streams and rivers at the bottom of the catchments. Just move to the next slide, please. So just moving on to vegetation type. In 2022, riparian margins were dominated by non-woody vegetation. This includes grass and weed species. So I've broken this down in the pie graph to the right there. So this sort of pink area there represents grass and weed species. 64% of bank length was occupied by grass and weeds. Woody native vegetation made up about 11% of the surveyed bank length. Flax, sedges and rushes 9%, and then the rest was made up by exotic woody species, including willows. The graph at the bottom there represents what shows the change in major vegetation types over time. What we've seen is a significant increase in native vegetation over time, and that's we've also seen a decrease in grass and weed species as well as willow species. I think really important here is to note that woody vegetation in association with non-woody vegetation is important for riparian ecosystem functions. So non-woody vegetation is important for filtering of sediment and nutrients, whereas woody riparian vegetation offers additional benefits. So, you know, shading of waterways, as well as improving stability of stream banks and a number of other ecosystem functions as well. Just move to the next slide, please. So looking here at vegetation width, in 2022, 37% of the surveyed bank length had a buffer width of less than 2 meters, and that's shown there on the pie graph to the right, whereas 23% of the surveyed bank length had a buffer width of greater than 10 meters. Overall, about 60% of surveyed bank length had vegetation width between 0 and 5 meters. The Waikato Regional Council Clean Stream Management Guide recommends a minimum setback of 5 meters. If we look at the literature, much of it would suggest that a buffer width of 10 meters is required if the objective is to achieve self-sustaining low maintenance indigenous vegetation. Ultimately, the size of an effective buffer is going to be dependent on a number of factors, including the specific functional objective of the riparian margin, and also site-specific factors, so slope, soil type, and aquatic features as well. It is interesting to note that if we focus specifically on the dairy land use, about 50% of the bank length that we assessed had vegetation widths of less than 2 meters. So although the proportion of fencing across dairy is really high, we often find that the buffer widths are really low. So there is a question there around the effectiveness of many of these riparian margins for carrying out the ecosystem function. So moving now on to stream bank erosion and disturbance. So in 2022, about 9% of the surveyed bank length had evidence of erosion. 5% was recent erosion, as shown on the pie graph there, and 4% was active erosion. We have seen this attribute fluctuate quite a lot over time, and it's due to a number of reasons, one being the magnitude and frequency of storm events, which is likely to change from year to year or across survey years. Another factor to consider is that observation of this attribute is somewhat subjective, although we do have a number of, obviously the large number of sites means that hopefully we take this into account. Something else to consider is that active erosion was considerably higher for dry stock compared to dairy, and we kind of expect this given that dairy tends to occur in flatter, less erodible land, whereas dry stock tends to occupy a lot more of your hilly, more erodible landscapes. So just in conclusion, the level of stock exclusion has remained largely unchanged from 2017 to 2022. Our survey results clearly demonstrate that there needs to be a greater focus towards dry stock land uses and supporting fencing and riparian restoration in these areas. Small to medium-sized waterways could benefit from future riparian fencing and restoration efforts. So we find that larger streams and rivers tend to be much better managed in terms of fencing and riparian management. There definitely needs to be a shift towards improved management of smaller waterways. The West Coast Management Zone clearly stands out as a zone that could benefit most from future riparian fencing efforts. We found that the rates of fencing in the West Coast are very low compared to other management zones. In terms of vegetation, the coverage of woody, native and flax, sedge and rush species has increased over time, I think is a good indication of, the impact of riparian restoration across the region. There's still much work to do in terms of encouraging the restoration of woody riparian restoration. So what I mentioned there in terms of the effectiveness of riparian margins, trying to get that mix of woody and non-woody vegetation right. And then just to note that we are looking to undertake the next survey in 2027 and 28. And again, this will provide a valuable data set to assess change over time in these riparian attributes. Thank you very much.
Kia ora. You wanted to have a question on slide 7? Can you take it back to slide 7, please? Is it this one? Your speaker.
My question was that support what you're trying to accomplish here. It's just disappointing that when we in our LTP we would, I think we got a bit confused of what some of what regional council does and what it doesn't. Got a bit with the heritage funding and where that money was going to be distributed. Got really a bit lost that what catchment works actually does and what we accomplish by putting more restoration in upper catchments. And like at the moment, what I understand is we can actually get more funding from hill country erosion at the moment, but we haven't got any more money to put ourselves to put the 1/3 up. So then farmers can put the other 1/3 up to do actually more hill country erosion with what you're trying to accomplish in other upper catchments. We actually haven't put the money in the LTP to actually help in this place enough, which is a bit disappointing. So I hope next term, if who's around the table as councillors, we actually put more emphasis in putting money into this spot that we can make more that farmers are supported in actually doing this restoration in upper catchments. So I think I don't think so. Well, I definitely didn't understand the importance when we were around the table earlier of supporting other ideas that staff had of actually supporting this area better. And I think that was misunderstood. And I'm not blaming anyone. We were a whole lot of 8 new councillors around the table that didn't realise most probably what that work was, that we thought we were going to support it through other things, but that's not where it gets funded from. So I just, so, yeah, and I was at a Federated Farmers meeting last night, and I know you're mainly talking about streams here, so I'm talking about drains. Where funding for habitat, shading of water, biodiversity, and weed control all had the same outcomes. So I think that's a big selling point too, that when we do restoration correctly, we actually lower costs to the catchment, that the catchment actually runs more naturally, but it also has weed control and all these other things from the shading that we have better outcomes. And I think that's the bit we don't really sell well. And I think we actually need to sell that bit better to the public, if that makes any sense. I think, yeah, we're really good at showing the data, but we actually need to sell it, and we need to get the buy-in from everybody to, and that's not your job here. That's us as the whole council. So no, I totally support what you've, and we see this all around the region. And yeah, sorry for muttering on a bit too long. Thank you.
Kia ora, Chris. Yeah, Pamela, whoever's first. Shut up, sorry.
Kia ora. Just following on from that, I think this is really great data. My question is where does this then tie into our policy program, right? So where are the recommendations that based on what you've found, here's some clear policy settings or prioritization that could allow us to address some of the differentials that we'd like to see an impact in. And I suppose I'm just interested, you've called out the West Coast as an area that we could have greater impact in. I'm keen to understand did you see any differential between the Waipa Waikato zone, which we know there's considerable support from the Waikato River Authority to undertake this type of work. Did you see a differential between that zone and potentially the Waiho-Piako zone or the Coromandel zone that don't have that, that funding facility in place?
Yes, so that is, we have undertaken that analysis to look, are you referring to fencing in particular or attributes? Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So in the final report, we outline the results for separate zones. So yeah, off the top of my head, Waiho-Piako fencing, yeah, was around 85% bank length effectively fenced, whereas West Coast would have been around 20%. Zones like, I think Central Waikato was between 70 and 80%. So we have that breakdown
So
for the various zones.
did you look at Waiho-Piako? Sorry, this was region-wide, right?
It's
So
region-wide, and then we break it down by management zone.
Okay.
And we also look at land use and stream order as part of
Great.
that. Yep.
Because I think it would be really helpful for us as counselors to get a real clear steer that says, okay, here's what the science is saying to us, or the data that we've got. Here's some potential changes we could make to policy settings or prioritization that would allow us to create a bigger impact.
Yeah.
You have an answer for Pamela?
Chair, I was just going to refer to that one, Pamela, and there's a link back to what Tracy was talking about earlier on in relation to farm plans. So this information feeds into those catchment context guidance that we provide landowners. Tim and others are also working closely with ICM in a number of indicator catchment programs around the region, looking to see how the works that we support farmers to do are having what impact that's having on water quality. And of course, we're also working into the freshwater policy review, and one of the key streams of that, as you're probably aware, is managing overland flow, and certainly particularly in hill country zones. So there's sort of quite a nice intersection of work we do with farmers and farm plans, work we do supporting farmers with specific actions in certain priority catchments, and then the policy work as well.
So Pamela, it was quite the conversation in the court around PC1 fencing, because the conversations in the court are around stock exclusion, and I know our surveys will be about fencing, and I imagine it's fixed. When you say fencing, they're talking solid post pile rail fencing.
Correct.
You're
So
talking about physical fencing.
what we're looking at here is effective fencing.
Yeah, and
Yep.
so there's quite the conversation, and there's quite a lot of economic analysis done, and particularly for our high country, particularly on our west coast, because of the large land areas and the cost of fencing. And the questions that the court is being posed with is around what does effective stock exclusion look like? So there's that issue that you're describing is absolutely being a very significant piece of the conversation around the PC1 court table around how do you effectively keep stock out of waterways, and then also how do you then effectively provide good riparian planting if you don't have solid fencing. So when you talk about policy settings, you've got a policy setting underway through PC1, which is looking at this very issue. And because you'll have seen a number of those, the large landowners here talking about the costs, and in particular when things happen, the fencing disappearing and having to re-put it in again. And so as farmers, you'll know how complex that is, but it's absolutely on the policy table that the team have been going through the court process over the last year or two.
Okay, I just want to make sure that counselors get the clear guidance that Councillor Cookson is referring to, that we need to be able to clearly see if we put some priority in this area, this is where we're going to get measurable change on some of these data points.
Yeah.
Yes, and there was a bit of, because the council has this challenge that historically some of those things weren't regulated, and so the council was providing money for people to voluntarily get involved with things, and the challenge about when does council put funding involved when it becomes a regulatory obligation, which is an obligation that's coming through the stock exclusion regs and then through freshwater farm plans and through PC1. There's that balance that the council needs to decide.
Bruce,
Yeah, sort of just going to a broader context. What Councillor Cookson is talking about is our need to evolve. I'm talking about the whole structure of council and the way you realise co-benefits, multiple benefits and co-benefits, because there's still some deep history in even the way we're collecting this information. And that is about a land management approach, which doesn't fully, I guess, harvest and make use of co-benefits and multiple benefits. And we have reviews going on in the organisation right now that I'm hoping might help some of that evolution, because even our council committee structure, I believe, is part of the problem. So, yeah, that's just sort of the high level context. I think the other concern I have really too is how this information does feed into policy development, but also the timeliness of the information. Because, you know, already I would imagine that the data that we're looking at now from this report is severely out of date because of various cyclone events in the Coromandel and other parts of the region. And so the statistics that we're looking at now and possibly looking at as favourable may not be quite as favourable as they are as of today. I don't know, because we haven't got the data. How many of those riparian plantings in some of those parts of the country that, you know, were badly impacted by the rainstorms and cyclone have we lost? How much riparian planting have we lost and are going to have to replace? So I guess that's my other concern, is that there must be some methodologies available to enable us to really stay ahead of current state of play. And this is state of the environment reporting of a style, and how we really better make use of that information to respond to what has happened. Do you want to say something now?
I was going to pose a question on your behalf to Mike and the team about the opportunities that satellites, AI, other sort of more real-time data richness can provide to be able to answer the sort of questions that the councillor is raising. Is that something that's on the agenda in the team?
Yes, I can start off. Yeah, we have certainly considered some of these emerging technologies, satellite imagery in particular. I think while it is could be a useful approach for some attributes, it doesn't help in other areas. So attributes like fencing, I think it does show some promise moving forward. But the other attributes around, say, the effectiveness of fencing or stock access at a particular time, even stream bank erosion, which you could just never detect using remote sensing technology. So I think, yeah, there is more work that needs to happen in that space. I think there are a lot of opportunities. But yeah, as I say, for some attributes, not all.
okay, Bruce?
Yeah, so just some further thoughts. The section of data that I was very impressed with was the matter relating to vegetation width. Because again, you know, we're sitting in a policy context where 2 meters was like, really? Is that enough for anything? And the recommendation of a minimum of 5, but the data also showing a good number of plantings are less than 5 metre width. And then the notion of the what is an adequate width to achieve a range of different goals. And so the setting of the 10 metre recommendation for a self-sustaining Indigenous system, my view, is an underestimate. I mean, when you say greater than 10 metres, what are you actually talking about? How much is enough? And I think some of the research on that is way outdated. And in terms of informing our policy development, the goal was, for example, to morph some of the riparian corridors into what one might call biodiversity corridors, which is happening in other parts of the country and some of the Waikato, it's happening. What would be the minimum for that? Again, I'm just coming back to the notion of co-benefits, multiple benefits, the actions that we take on the landscape. And yeah, so I do see potential in this data, but I'm also wondering about the way this information is being collected, about whether that is the appropriate one to realize multiple benefits for our region.
Food for
30 metres
Food
gets
for
you into
thought.
the ETS.
You don't answer to that? Somebody has
sorry.
got there or got there.
So yeah, again, those are those conversations that have happened through the entirety of the PC1 process around what is the number for the setback, and I think it's 3. If somebody, yeah, it's 3 that's in the PC1, and
Yeah.
of course there's been all those compromises and negotiations that have happened over the course of time. And remember, PC1 is the first part of the journey, get people on the journey, and then maybe further down the track it might look different. But right now, I think PC1 is saying 3 metres, and
Yep.
so, but of course we need PC1 to be live.
You know what I think about 3 metres, don't you? I don't need to say anything more. Thanks for that.
But it's PC1.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Does your technical report go into analysis that includes the recent State of the Environment report outcomes? I'm kind of trying to link this with the State of the Environment report Mike presented a year and a half ago, or a year ago. Does it go into that? Because that's kind of where I'm going, and I'd like to have the analysis of the linkage. So I remember there was some higher E. coli numbers than we were expecting. And I mean, the flatlining on this, if riparian margins have such an effect, might help explain.
So
Speculating.
so through you, Chair, with more than 20 years spread of data, we've got 30 years spread of water quality data throughout the region.
That's right.
The opportunity for us to compare and contrast the riparian
impact.
information with
Yeah.
the water quality information is something we've talked about several times previously. And while we have, as I mentioned, these catchment environmental monitoring programs at certain high priority catchments around the region that ICM lead and we support, they give us a detailed look at a particular catchment. We've got really detailed information about changes in land management practice. I think what you're alluding to is something at a regional scale and I think it's really a really high priority need for information is, can we pick up signals of improving riparian condition in our water quality monitoring? And that is something we've talked about doing, but we haven't put in process yet.
Okay. Yeah, because that I would think that a lot of the times these other things we do, it'd be nice to reflect back to the SOE as the baseline we measure for the community over time. Then going on from that, same as what Chair Story said, I would actually quite like an analysis on the more detailed recommendations, and I think it'd be quite good if they did come to full council. In the time we've got left in this triennium, that'd be a nice thing to come out of this committee. It's just a suggestion. But what are we going to do differently? What do we ask others to do differently? And also not just policy development, because we know how long that can take. We'll have a whole new data decade before that happens, sometimes. So maybe also in the what can Tracy's team do, that more incentive based piece. Yeah, that's what I would. The direction I'd want to go in.
I can phrase what I think that maybe I'm trying to think of it as a question that can be posed that teams go away and come back with, is that something was happening between 2002 and 2017 that was seeing a trend.
Yes.
Something is happening which is resulting in there being a flatlining.
Yes.
Do we know enough about what was the positive causation of that upward trend,
Yeah, it's
the
part of the
causation
analysis.
of the trend that we've seen recently, and what might be the options for recreating a positive trend? Is that kind of the...
Yeah, I mean, that's very much part of the analysis. And then I think I mean, I was hanging out with dairy farmers back 20 years ago, and they were scoffing at how the dry stock farmers didn't have to do the fencing. I feel like we're saying here in this presentation, we should start focusing on the dry stock, but I feel like that has been known about for a long, long time.
So if I pose that to the team,
Yeah.
what the committee is really, really keen on is being able to capture the richness of all the great work that you do,
Yeah.
to turn it into positive action.
Yeah,
And
real life.
you'll have heard the timeliness about how do we find out things sooner rather than further down the track. So if you have the opportunity to be able to, is that a question that you would be able to pose and then answer for a future? Because then we can then have that move from this committee through to the council as a whole to say, this committee is tasked with overseeing how things are going. They're seeing that there's been this flat line in terms of progress, that there needs to be some other form of intervention if we're going to get some positive action and looking for some
What do we think
recommendations.
bar chart move?
Is that something
Yeah.
that you guys can do?
Along with Brent. So I'm not sure where we process to or progress it to, but in the minutes, we do have a space where the chair of that Ropu speaks to the bigger council. I've just asked Brooke to highlight some of these corridor in there, so it gets tabled at the council meeting to be picked up, instead of waiting, because we only meet quarterly. But if we take some of the corridor that you're talking about to help it progress within the next council meeting, then from that meeting, we should be able to decide how much of this moves out of here or how much of it we roll into it to move up somewhere else to get these looked at.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we could have milestones. That part of it
Yeah,
doesn't have
that's
to be
right,
this
so-
massive 6-month analysis.
In my
But I mean, even
feedback-
just the West Coast
Yeah.
piece, if you give some
Yeah.
more
In
detail
my
of what that
feedback
looks
to
like.
the whole council,
Yeah.
these little points will come out from the minutes. Because the minutes, as you know, what minutes look like, and I do have a corridor
Yeah.
in those minutes, and I can bring up some of the stuff that this was brought up in our meeting. Then it'll get tabled at the council meeting, and it's
Appreciate that.
part of Chair Pamela's.
Yeah, just a further thought, which I forgot to mention in my earlier comments. And when an opportunity like the West Coast Catchment Group, West Waikato Catchment Group presents itself, that we move as quickly as possible. I know you guys have now met with them and the fact that, they've received money from MPI to help them set all of this up. And that's part of what Councillor Cookson was talking about, the opportunity presented by the co-funding, but now to have a amazing group of willing landowners who really want to get this going quickly. And I actually think they've already made their phone call about up and coming planting opportunities for riparian planting in the area where they've just started the catchment group. So yeah, how we move quickly to address the things that are being revealed in reports like.
Yeah, so it's so specifically on that catchment group space, it's always, the catchment groups always need support. And what Tracy Nelson didn't mention earlier is that we've got recommitment from MFE to fund 2 roles for the next 12 months. And we're currently advertising them right now to get 2 people in to work specifically with catchment groups. Because we see the same thing, catchment groups are a real powerhouse, but they need support. And so, yeah.
Sorry, Robbie.
No,
Last one.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, we were lucky enough, well, not so much us, but the catchment, Waihaupia, of getting funding for many years for fencing of channel and river. So we were, and because it's mainly dairy, it's only 2 or 3 hot wires, makes it stock exclusion. But in these hill country spots, it's 7 wires and battens. So you're going from $6 a metre to most probably $28 a metre in fencing costs. So it is a huge investment for these landowners. So I fully support if you're gonna go to and try and fence off these areas, these landowners need full support of how they're going to accomplish this, and you got to take the low hanging fruit really easily off it, because that's you can't go. You don't want them spending money where it's going to be not well
utilised is what I'm trying, because it's very expensive to go down this path. And I'm not saying that anyway, I'm just saying it was a lot easier for us on flat land than it is for hill country guys. It's a huge cost, and it's going to take a lot of support. And just going on to what Bruce said, I think there's a new paper out done by Landcare about biodiversity outcomes and stream plantings and stuff. I forget what it is. Actually, Louise Saunders was telling me about it the other night. And in that, it actually says that hubs down a waterway are far more beneficial to biodiversity outcomes than complete plantings, because the biggest biodiversity outcome is between where you've done the hub and it goes back to normal or whatever, grasslands or whatever, and that's where the biggest biodiversity outcomes come from. So be mostly, I don't know if you've read the paper or not, but I definitely want to read it, because it sounds like it's quite interesting of where we should actually take some learnings from others, that we shouldn't try and recreate the wheel all the time anyway, but because I think we should actually use all of these tools, and actually grass is a great thing for nutrient catching in places. So we should actually use grass in that net lot that's growing there to be used as a filter at times. So I think in years to come, this council is going to actually have to talk about stock exclusion on sensitive areas, but not all the time, but in certain periods of the year where there would be a benefit to the catchment of cut and carry of that the nutrients are caught, take it back to the platform of where you're farming and not next to the waterways. So I think that's a discussion, and I think farmers are up to that discussion as well, that you have a buffer zone when you need it and when you don't need it in the summertime, or in 9 months of the year when the buffer zone is not needed. So I think there's a bigger discussion in this at some time in the future of how we manage our waterways better, and there's better outcomes for biodiversity and water quality and all sorts of things. It's just, I suppose we just got to one day put our big boy pants on and actually have the big talk about how we do this as a region. But yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, guys. I believe that's it. Thanks for your reports, and I look forward to where this leads to, around riparian strips. And just for a quick commentary, the PC one, we did say 3 meters. At that time, it was more about keeping the stock out of the waterway than worrying about, because of the leaching, it's they say it's 80 years for the leaching in the ground for the nutrients to get to the waterway. So all we ever did was look at, well, let's stop the stock getting into the water. And then someone said 5, and now you're saying 10. All of this depends on whether the farmer is willing to give their land up as well. So there's a lot of questions in there. But thanks for your report, guys. Yep. Have a good rest of the day. And that comes to the conclusion of our hui. And we're going to have someone to move this and second it. Yep. Enormous pick of people. I'm happy to say that.
Just before you leave, team, just before I pose to the karakia, thank you very much for the work that you do. And can you feed back through to your teams? One of the things that we're really keen on is for everybody to see what piece they play in the direction of the organisation. And some of the people who are being out walking streams, catching little bits of information, they might not realise that actually the work that they collectively do enables these reports to be prepared, which enables councillors then to look and say, oh, that information gives us really richness to be able to set policy direction to then generate the improvements that we want to see. So really important work that you do. So thank you for all the mahi.
Okay, thank you everybody for giving up your time.
So
Brent is going to close it with a karakia in there.
So unahia mai te ura tapanui, kia wātia kia mama, te nākau te tinana, te hinenaro. E te ara takatū, koe rā I rongo, e whakaria a kikironga, kia tina, homie, huie, tā kie.
Unfortunately, lunch today, Koto, is not done by the caterers because they said they couldn't make here.